2019 Formula One World Championship is finally go. Here at Albert Park we had the first official session, two 90-minute free practice sessions, with Lewis Hamilton setting the pace for Mercedes. So Mercedes 1-2, Valtteri Bottas in second place in the second session, which was the quicker of the day, with the nearest challenger, the Red Bull of Max Verstappen, 0.8 of a second down in third place. I'm joined here by Scott Mitchell to have a look at the day. Now Scott, in testing, we all thought, us, the teams, everyone, that Ferrari had the advantage, yet today it's Mercedes that set the pace and Ferrari was nowhere, for want of a better word. So what's going on?
Yeah, I think that's the big question mark from day one. I mean, when you look at it, the base logic is, well, we don't know how fast Ferrari could be, but there's no way they can be this far off the pace. I think that's sort of the broad way of looking at it. So that's what makes me pretty adamant that whatever they were doing today, it wasn't obviously what we're going to see in qualifying on Saturday. It could have been, I think you were suggesting earlier, it could just be they did their qualifying sim, but they just did it at high fuel. I know that there were some suggestions that Sebastian Vettel in particular wasn't massively happy with the balance of his car. We saw him have a little moment off at turn one. So I think we just haven't seen the full performance of the Ferrari. To borrow something that Mercedes technical director James Allison said, it's still way too early in the weekend to know exactly where everyone stands. But I think the fact that the Mercedes drivers were, I think, half a tenth apart or so, and right at the top of the leaderboard, we can say with fair certainty that was them showing a bit more of their hand than Ferrari. And even the Red Bull of Max Verstappen, some 0.8 off the pace, which I don't really think is where the Red Bull Honda is right now.
Well, a few interesting numbers there. Max Verstappen, because he did a slightly strange programme, he spent a lot of time on the medium tyres before doing his performance run late, and then he stayed out at the end of that performance run. So the number of laps he did means we definitely know he had at least an excess 0.6 worth of fuel on board, which would have got him to a couple of tenths off the Mercedes. So there's an asterisk there against him. When it comes to Ferrari, if we look at the improvements in terms of pace people made from FP1 to FP2, Mercedes, for example, made a 1 second step, which is fairly in line with what everyone else was doing. Ferrari was only about 0.16 quicker. So that to me says, yeah, there's some time in the locker there for Ferrari. So there's all these caveats and question marks that suggest that while we don't know exactly how much Ferrari is holding back by, they clearly are.
Yeah, and I think it's, we were saying before when we were off air, like, it's almost like Ferrari are playing with the opposition. And I'm sure that's not it. I'm sure that's not entirely their motivation. They'll have been doing their work on the simulator up till now, so they've probably got a fairly good baseline of where they think they are for qualifying performance, and there's very limited relevant track time. So they're going to be obviously focusing the good parts of the day to making sure their race setup is better. But track position is important here. So it's going to be, what I'm curious to see now going into Saturday is, has Ferrari sort of, has it dropped the ball a little bit? Did they really need to go out there today and punch in a proper qualifying lap? Or because they might be taking too much of a risk by going into Saturday FP3 and then doing an absolutely nailed-on qualifying sim, because track position is so important. If they've messed up or potentially limited or restricted, hurt their preparations for qualifying, maybe that could come back to bite them in 24 hours' time.
Yeah, you've got to be careful. If you leave unknowns on the table, you never know what happens. Well, I've got my trusty notebook here, which I've been crunching the numbers, because today is not just about the single lap pace, it's also about the long runs. Now, in terms of the Mercedes pace, it tells a similar story. Lewis Hamilton was the quickest. He was averaging 28.2 on his long run on the softs, so that puts him well ahead. It's quite messy behind, but there was an interesting comparison with the two Ferraris. Now, Sebastian Vettel did a soft run, averaging 29.1. Not very quick, almost a second off the Mercedes. But Charles Leclerc did a long run on hards, which was very, very similar in pace to Vettel. Now that's 2 steps tyre softer than what Hamilton had, Scott. So that suggests to me, again, that there's some hidden pace in the Ferrari that we started to see a little bit of on the hard tyres.
Well, they were so confident during testing, everything from the drivability of the car to sort of how easy it was to sort of get to the limit, short runs, long runs, different tyres. The Ferrari was just working really well. And Albert Park is a tricky and very different circuit to Barcelona. It's a street circuit. It's not used throughout the year. It's the first race of the season, so everyone's sort of got their own things they need to work through. So it is really, really difficult to get an actual read and make direct comparisons to Barcelona. But I would be absolutely stunned if Ferrari doesn't make a massive leap up the leaderboard. And I'm not saying that they're going to suddenly emerge on Saturday and be half a second faster, but Lewis Hamilton said on Thursday that they weren't BSing when Mercedes said that they had work to do. They still think that Ferrari holds the advantage. Come to today, Ferrari team principal Mattia Binotto was saying, oh, well, I'm not entirely confident. But Mercedes clearly identifies Ferrari as the team to beat. Ferrari says Mercedes is the team to beat. We've got the Times today suggest it's Mercedes business as usual. The multiple world champions that have dominated the last few years are still on top. But I'm not so convinced. I think the picture will change. We know that Ferrari always makes a nice step from Friday to Saturday. That was certainly a trait from last year. So I would expect to see something a little bit quicker, a little bit more representative, shall we say, in FP3 and certainly in qualifying.
Yeah, I think come qualifying, I'd be surprised to see Ferrari behind, shall we say. Maybe the Mercedes have made some gains. They've done a lot of work and analysis on their upgrade package that they had for the second test. So they may have gained. We thought it was maybe a 3/10 gap in testing. But I still think Ferrari, if I had to bet on it, I'd still go with them. We should also have a look down the order. Now, it was quite messy in terms of the long runs. Everyone seemed to be at a similar kind of pace. But both on single lap pace in the midfield and by a smidgen on long run pace, the Alfa was the strongest. We saw the Alfa and the Renault both looking strong. The Haas a few tenths back from that, and then very congested. The McLaren of Sainz did a decent long run pace, so it's messy there. But the picture in the midfield isn't so far out of line with what we saw in testing, is it?
No, crazy close with a few teams, and as we thought, circuit characteristics, car characteristics playing and suiting different teams differently. But I think the Alfa Romeo does look really good. Kimi Räikkönen really quick today. Had a brief chat with Antonio Giovinazzi, who laughed and said when asked if he thinks that's real, does he really think that they're ahead of the midfield, he laughed and said, well, I hope so. I think they should be quietly optimistic. I think Renault were quite happy with where their day ended up, but they'd had a couple of setbacks on the reliability side. Haas, we know, is traditionally very strong here, so I'm expecting them to be in the mix. Those are the three teams. I know that we saw some good laps from Daniel Kvyat in the Toro Rosso, but we also saw quite a few mistakes from him and Alexander Albon. So I'm just wondering if those two maybe just aren't quite at it. I mean, Friday practice is Friday practice, so that is kind of what it's there for. I remember a few years ago when Sebastian Vettel was at Red Bull and he developed this little reputation, didn't he, for overstepping the mark in Friday, because that's what it's there for. You find your limits. So that midfield battle is going to be ultra tight. The thing I am expecting to see linked to the midfield battle, we didn't really mention them in much detail with that front group, is on lap time alone the Red Bull wasn't massively clear, was it, of the midfield? But we are expecting that to change, aren't we? But maybe not quite on maybe Mercedes Ferrari level.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see where Red Bull come out, but yeah, there is clearly going to be the gap between the top three and the rest. Interestingly, on Toro Rosso, I was watching down at turn 1 and 2 in FP1, and the Toro Rosso looked like a car. They were carrying good speed in, but it didn't look massively planted, shall we say. And Alexander Albon, even before he had his spin and caught the wall in FP1, had a few moments where the rear wasn't quite behaving in the middle of the corner. So that Toro Rosso is an interesting one. It looks reasonably brisk, but it doesn't look like it's got the downforce of the three midfield teams we expect to be ahead of it. So it's going to be interesting to see how they go tomorrow.
But what I would say is that however bad the Toro Rosso looked, or not necessarily bad, but not fantastic the Toro Rosso looked, that must have paled in comparison to what you saw from the team that's marooned on its own at the back of the grid. Because when you were trackside, I think you messaged me and said, oh, the Williams might be even worse than I expected. So what did you see from the Williams?
Well, George Russell said yesterday that they could only exceed expectations because they were so low from the outside. But yeah, I was worried about the Williams. It was both drivers just looked a bit all over the place, by which I mean both cars looked all over the place. The front end, the rear end, the traction.
What I would say is that speaking to the drivers at the end of the day, George Russell said that the car didn't feel as bad as it looked. I can read that one of two ways. One, you can say that there's obviously a solid base there. Maybe they can build on it and find some more performance. I would maybe interpret that, maybe I'm a cynic, I would interpret that a little bit more negatively. I would say that sounds to me like a car that's just fundamentally not very quick. Not necessarily bad to drive, just can't really take it to the limit or go very quickly. Robert Kubica claimed that he was held back by some damage. I think it was a little bit of damage on the edge of the floor, but the team didn't seem overly concerned by it. Robert claimed that meant that he was having to avoid the curbs and take it a little bit easy. I'm not entirely convinced if that's actually the case, or if maybe he's just a bit unhappy and making a bit of a mountain out of a molehill, because there are clearly problems with the car, fundamental problems. It's not as bad as it was last year, because last year the drivers were saying how unpredictable it was. It doesn't seem to be that way, but there does just seem to be something that's gone really wrong in the build of that car. And Russell and Kubica might think that maybe there's a bit more positivity to come tomorrow. So I think FP3 is absolutely vital for Williams. They've got to show pace. They've got to show improvement, because if they want to qualify respectably and race well, or at least be with a chance of racing at the back of the midfield, they need to find serious gains after Friday.
Well, we've had a few questions answered today. We've had a few questions raised as well. And as Scott says, tomorrow, an hour of free practice and then qualifying. Now, Saturday afternoon qualifying is when they'll all lay their cards on the table. Personally, I still think Ferrari is looking strong. We've not seen anything like what they've got, but I have been quite impressed with the Mercedes, so we could even have a much closer battle than we anticipated. We'll find out tomorrow.